Diana sat perfectly still on the stiff, geometric confines of the mid-century modern sofa in the expansive reception area of Kingsley Textiles. At 35, the striking black woman exuded a quiet, formidable elegance in her tailored emerald suit, a shade that perfectly complemented the subtle gold jewelry she wore. Yet, not a single person crossing the polished Italian marble floors cast a second glance in her direction. She was a ghost in the very corporate headquarters she had quietly inherited just 1 month prior, following the sudden passing of her intensely private father. The young receptionist, Chloe, wearing sleek wireless earbuds and a distinctly condescending smile, had brusquely instructed her to take a seat in the waiting area. Chloe had sharply noted that the chief operating officer, Marcus, was hosting a critical, highly classified executive session and absolutely could not be disturbed by unannounced regional managers or sales reps looking for a quick pitch. Diana had accepted the slight without a single word of protest, crossing her long legs and resting her hands softly on her vintage leather briefcase. She wasn't just a regional manager, and Marcus wasn't just her boss. He was the man her late father had trusted to run the day-to-day operations of the billion-dollar empire. Because her father had always fiercely shielded his family from the unforgiving corporate spotlight, maintaining their absolute privacy for decades. Very few employees actually knew the face of the sole heir. To them, Diana was just another mid-level name on the sprawling payroll, allegedly returning from a long, tedious overseas assignment. Through the heavy frosted glass of the main boardroom, she could hear the booming, arrogant laughter of Marcus and his inner circle of sycophants. They were undoubtedly drinking her father's expensive reserve scotch, celebrating a massive victory she supposedly knew nothing about. Diana checked the vintage gold watch that had once belonged to her father, its weight a comforting anchor on her wrist. It was exactly 4:15 p.m. They were operating under the arrogant assumption that she was stranded in a London hotel due to a miraculously timed visa issue that Marcus had personally arranged to keep her out of the country. They had no idea she had seen right through the administrative sabotage, chartered a private jet through a shell company, and landed in New York just 3 hours ago. She allowed them to enjoy their triumphant laughter for a few more minutes, savoring the bitter, intoxicating irony of the situation. Let them think they had won. Let them firmly believe she was locked out of her own empire. The treacherous foundation of Marcus's betrayal had been exposed 48 hours earlier, violently shattering the quiet sanctuary of Diana's London hotel room. It was well past midnight, the rain lashing against the glass balcony doors, when her private cell phone illuminated the darkness. The encrypted caller ID displayed the name Arthur, the veteran chief financial officer who had loyally served the Kingsley family for nearly 3 decades. Arthur was a notoriously stoic man, known for his emotionless delivery of quarterly earnings. But when Diana answered, his voice carried a frantic, breathless tremor that immediately made her blood run cold. He informed her, speaking in rushed, hushed tones, that Marcus was quietly orchestrating an emergency board meeting for a massive capital restructuring. Marcus claimed to possess a signed, legally binding power of attorney, granting him absolute authority to execute the corporate maneuver on Diana's behalf due to her indefinite overseas absence. Diana had stepped out onto her hotel balcony, the frigid London air stinging her skin, instantly waking her from her jet-lagged haze. She explicitly told Arthur she had never signed any such authorization, nor had she ever discussed delegating her executive voting rights. Arthur gravely replied that he knew the truth, which was precisely why he was calling on a secure, untraceable line. If Marcus successfully pushed the vote through, he would authorize a massive issuance of new company shares under the guise of raising emergency liquidity. These shares were slated to be immediately purchased by a mysterious external private equity firm. Within seconds, Diana's commanding 51% majority ownership would be ruthlessly diluted to a powerless, symbolic minority stake. The legacy her grandfather had painstakingly built from a single, dusty textile warehouse in Brooklyn, which she, as a proud black woman, had promised to protect and expand, would be stripped away in a flurry of legalized theft. To legally bypass her physical presence and override the ironclad company bylaws. Marcus had to have presented a flawless forgery to the corporate notary. Arthur promised to leverage every contact he had in the city to secure the forensic evidence before the final gavel fell. Now, sitting patiently outside the boardroom in the chilly New York air conditioning, Diana felt her phone vibrate against her thigh. It was a secure text from Arthur. He was in the building, and he wasn't alone. Diana remained seemingly relaxed in the reception area, her posture immaculate, smoothly sliding her phone from her pocket to review Arthur's heavily encrypted message. Attached to the secure email was a high-resolution scanned copy of a comprehensive forensic handwriting analysis. Official, sworn report conclusively destroyed Marcus's fabricated document. The signature had not been forged by human hands. It had been meticulously replicated using highly advanced cryptographic reproduction software. It was a restricted, military-grade technology utilized only by elite corporate intelligence firms and specialized fraud units. As Diana scrolled through the damning, highly technical evidence, a specific name caught her eye, causing a sharp flare of calculated anger in her chest. The software was proprietary to a boutique consulting firm previously managed by Julian, the slick, aggressively ambitious external advisor. Marcus had forced onto the executive board just 6 months ago under the pretense of modernizing their corporate strategy. Everything instantly clicked into place with sickening, crystalline clarity. This wasn't merely Marcus acting out of sudden, unchecked greed or opportunistic ambition. It was a deeply sophisticated, meticulously premeditated, hostile takeover that had been brewing for months. Julian had provided the highly specialized technical tools, the forged notary stamps, and the murky legal loopholes required to bypass Kingsley Textile's ironclad governance bylaws. They had waited patiently until she was an ocean away, actively isolated her communications, sabotaged her travel documents, and moved in for the absolute kill. Diana looked toward the frosted glass partition. She could discern Julian's sharp, tailored silhouette pacing confidently at the head of the long oak table, gesturing grandly as he presented his entirely fraudulent financial projections to the mesmerized board. He was treating her family's legacy like a cheap commodity, a carcass to be butchered and sold for spare parts. She felt a profound, heavy sadness momentarily wash over her before it rapidly calcified into an icy, unyielding resolve. Marcus had mentored her when she was just a teenager. He had taught her the ruthless intricacies of global supply chains. He had sat at her family's dining table, laughing and drinking wine with her father. Now, he was the primary architect of her intended ruin. She tapped a brief, cold reply to Arthur, instructing him to completely bypass the standard security checkpoints and head directly to the executive floor via the private freight elevator. Inside the heavily soundproofed boardroom, the atmosphere was electric with the intoxicating thrill of impending corporate theft. However, directly through a narrow, transparent vertical strip designed into the modern glass wall, meant to provide a sleek architectural aesthetic, someone was looking back at Diana. It was Leo, the youngest senior financial analyst on the executive committee, barely 30 years old. Leo was a brilliant, anxious numbers prodigy who had deeply idolized Diana's late father, crediting the man with pulling him out of a dead-end internship and paying for his advanced degrees, unlike the older, greed-blinded executives. Leo froze completely when his eyes locked onto the woman sitting so patiently in the lobby. He recognized the tailored emerald suit, the vintage gold watch gleaming under the recessed lighting, and the fierce, unyielding posture that mirrored the founders perfectly. He had seen the private family photographs kept in the secure archives. He knew exactly who was sitting on that mid-century sofa, being ignored by the entire floor. Leo's hand hovered nervously over his thick stack of heavily manipulated financial printouts. His breathing hitched, visibly trapped between his mandatory corporate duty to the COO and the terrifying, awe-inspiring realization that the true queen had returned to defend her throne. For a fleeting second, it seemed he might shout out, knocking over his chair to warn the conspirators of the impending Category 5 storm sitting just 30 feet away. Diana met his terrified, wide-eyed gaze with absolute, chilling calm. She did not wave. She did not smile. She did not break eye contact. She simply gave a slow, millimeter-deep shake of her head. It was a silent, absolute command to hold his tongue and watch the execution unfold. Leo swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as the color rapidly drained from his youthful face. He gave a microscopic nod of total understanding, instantly averting his eyes and aggressively pretending to study the spreadsheets in front of him, his hands trembling slightly. Diana checked her watch once more, her pulse remarkably steady. 4:28 p.m. The board was scheduled to cast their final binding vote at exactly 4:30 p.m. The trap was perfectly, flawlessly set. She just needed one more crucial piece to fall into place before she tore the room apart and burned their ambitions to the ground. Her phone buzzed again, a triple vibration. Her grandmother was in the elevator, through the thick glass. Marcus's voice finally rose above the low murmurs, projecting a sickeningly smooth, practiced authority. I was addressing the board of directors, formally requesting the motion to approve the accelerated capital expansion and the immediate, unconditional sale of the newly minted shares to Apex Holdings. Diana pulled out her phone and rapidly accessed the secure financial databases she still retained master clearance for. By passing the blocks, Julian thought he had successfully erected. Apex Holdings was exactly what she had anticipated: a ghost entity, a financial mirage. It was an obscure, hollow shell corporation registered just 8 months ago in a tiny, windowless tax processing office in Delaware. It boasted no public trading history, 0 legitimate corporate operations, no registered employees, and absolutely no physical assets. The criminal architecture of the plot was devastatingly simple, but highly effective. Marcus and Julian weren't just diluting her family's ownership to seize control. They were intentionally selling Kingsley Textile's most lucrative East Coast manufacturing facilities and patent portfolios to their own secretly controlled fund for a fraction of their true market value. Once the dust settled, the ink dried, and the main company was financially crippled, Apex Holdings would quietly liquidate those premium assets on the open market, generating hundreds of millions in pure, untraceable, tax-free profit. Marcus would pocket a generational fortune. Julian would collect an exorbitant consulting fee for facilitating the theft. And Diana would be left reigning over a hollowed-out corporate carcass, drowning in orchestrated debt. They were essentially burning her historic house down simply to sell the copper wiring inside the walls. Marcus confidently raised his hands, silencing the murmuring room. He dramatically announced that because the majority shareholder, Diana, was unfortunately unavailable and unreachable, his legally validated power of attorney would serve as the deciding factor to save the company from a fabricated liquidity crisis. He asked for a show of hands. Diana stood up, her movements fluid and deliberate, smoothing the lapels of her emerald jacket. The waiting game was officially over. Diana didn't just open the heavy boardroom door. She pushed it wide with such commanding, righteous force that the heavy steel handle violently slammed against the wall stopper, echoing through the room like a gunshot. The suffocating, celebratory silence that instantly crashed over the room was absolute, heavy enough to choke on. 12 highly paid executives, caught deep in the act of corporate treason, snapped their heads toward the doorway in unison. Marcus's smug, triumphant expression dissolved instantly, his jaw dropping as all the blood aggressively rushed from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. He looked as though the polished hardwood floor had vanished beneath him, staring at an apparition. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Diana stated, her voice smooth, melodic, and lethally calm, slicing through the tension like a razor. She stepped confidently into the bright room, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. Each step a countdown to their destruction. "Please forgive my unexpected intrusion. My boss told the receptionist to make me wait outside like a total stranger. But seeing as you are currently attempting to pawn off my family's legacy to a Delaware shell company, I decided my appointment had officially begun." Nobody dared to breathe. Julian's heavily manicured hands began to tremble so violently that the expensive silver pen he was holding clattered loudly onto the oak table, rolling off the edge. Marcus practically choked on his own saliva, stammering her name, frantically trying to construct a cohesive sentence from his shattered reality. He weakly protested that they genuinely believed she was trapped in London, that the meeting was merely a routine procedural update meant to protect her assets. Diana walked slowly around the expansive table, her eyes locked dead onto Marcus's terrified face, ignoring the others completely. She deliberately bypassed the empty leather chair at the head of the table, choosing instead to stand right behind Marcus, physically looming over his shrinking posture, her shadow falling across his forged documents. "Routine," she whispered coldly, the word dripping with venom. "Since when does a routine update require a forged signature and a phantom holding company?" Before Marcus could mount a pathetic, scrambling defense against the direct accusation of forgery, the boardroom door swung open a second time. Standing perfectly framed in the doorway was Eleanor, Diana's 78-year-old grandmother. The fierce matriarch of the Kingsley family leaned heavily on a polished mahogany cane, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her piercing dark eyes sweeping the room like a seasoned, unforgiving general inspecting a line of treacherous, mutinous soldiers. Eleanor had marched alongside her husband during the civil rights movement, facing down police dogs and water hoses, and had personally built this company's first payroll system by hand at a kitchen table. She was absolutely not a woman who tolerated thieves in her house, nor did she suffer fools lightly. "I see I'm right on time for the execution," Eleanor announced, her raspy voice carrying a terrifying, historical weight that pinned everyone to their seats. She walked slowly toward the table, the rhythmic, heavy tapping of her cane sounding like a ticking clock marking the end of their careers. The older board members, men who had known her for decades, immediately averted their eyes in profound, agonizing shame. Eleanor stopped directly across from Julian, the slick, arrogant advisor. She stared at him with such intense, unadulterated disgust that the younger man physically recoiled in his expensive ergonomic chair. "You must be the parasite my son warned me about before he passed," Eleanor said coldly, not raising her voice but projecting pure menace. Julian opened his mouth to object, to spout some legal jargon, but Eleanor slammed the tip of her cane onto the floor with a crack. "Shut your mouth. You are entirely out of your depth, little boy." She then turned her formidable, heartbreaking gaze to Marcus. "And you, we fed you. We brought you into our home when you had nothing. My husband treated you like a second son. And you repay us by forging my granddaughter's name like a common street hustler." Marcus buried his face in his trembling hands, utterly shattered by the immense psychological weight of the matriarch's judgment. A grown man reduced to a sobbing child. The heavy, suffocating silence was finally broken by Leo. The young analyst stood up, his knees visibly shaking against the table leg, but his voice was remarkably steady, bolstered by Diana's presence. He looked directly at Diana, bypassing his superiors, and loudly declared that she needed to see the complete financial picture before the police arrived. Leo aggressively pushed his laptop toward the center of the table, tapping a rapid sequence of keys to project his screen onto the massive 80-inch wall monitor. The screen illuminated the dark room with rows of highly classified, meticulously hidden international wire transfers, Leo explained, his voice gaining confidence with every word, that he had spent the last 3 nights bypassing Julian's restricted firewalls, risking his own career and freedom to uncover the absolute truth. The digital data was damning, flawless, and irrefutable. Every 2 weeks for the past 6 months, massive offshore payments had been systematically funneled from a subsidiary of Apex Holdings directly into a hidden Cayman Islands account legally registered to Marcus's brother-in-law, which then fed into Marcus's personal trust. It was not just a hostile corporate takeover, it was explicit, highly documented, multi-million-dollar bribery. Marcus looked up, tears streaming down his face, realizing his total destruction was now undeniable public record. He desperately pleaded with Diana, claiming he only did it because he felt profoundly unappreciated and financially squeezed by a bad divorce. He argued he had run the company flawlessly for years while her father was sick, yet the ultimate power was handed to a younger woman simply because of her bloodline. His fragile male ego and intense professional jealousy had completely consumed his moral compass. Diana stared at him without a single ounce of pity, her expression carved from stone. You were paid millions in salary, stock options, and bonuses. Marcus, you weren't a victim of nepotism. You were a highly compensated steward of my family's property. Your greed is your own cross to bear. Do not dare blame my father's legacy, or my gender, for your profound lack of character and basic human decency. Suddenly, realizing that prison was no longer a possibility, but an absolute certainty, Julian lunged forward like a cornered animal, frantically grabbing his laptop. If they couldn't win the vote, he fully intended to trigger a remote wipe protocol to permanently erase the local servers containing the fabricated Delaware contracts, the cryptographic software logs, and the wire transfer history. It was a desperate, chaotic attempt to destroy the digital paper trail before federal law enforcement could be involved. The servers are going down. You have nothing but screenshots, Julian yelled, his fingers scrambling frantically across the keyboard to initiate the military-grade purge protocol his firm had installed deep in the company's IT infrastructure. But before the progress bar could even register on his glowing screen, the boardroom doors flew open for the third and final time. Arthur, the stoic chief financial officer, marched in flanked by Vance, the towering, no-nonsense head of corporate security. Arthur calmly adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at Julian with mild, almost pitying amusement. Save your energy, Julian. I physically severed the central servers from the external network and the local intranet 20 minutes ago. I literally took an axe to the fiber optic cables in the basement. Your little wipe command is bouncing off a dead router. Vance stepped forward, firmly placing his massive, heavy hands on Julian's shoulders, effectively pinning the slick advisor to his chair, ending the tech rebellion instantly. Arthur then walked to the table and placed a thick leather binder in front of Diana, the original, physical copies of the forged notary documents, secured directly from the compromised notary who had already flipped to save himself. But Arthur wasn't finished. He looked solemnly at Diana, his eyes filled with sorrow. The offshore accounts didn't just trace back to Apex Holdings. Diana, the initial seed money for the Ghost Fund, the $5 million used to set up the shell, it came from Richard. Diana's breath hitched, the air knocked out of her lungs. Richard was her late father's absolute oldest friend, his college roommate, and a minority board member who was mysteriously sick and absent from today's vote. The betrayal ran deeper and much darker than she could have ever imagined. 3 months later, the atmosphere inside the Kingsley Textiles headquarters was remarkably different. The toxic, suffocating tension of paranoia and greed that had previously poisoned the executive floor had been entirely eradicated, replaced by a culture of transparency and rigorous accountability. The crisp autumn sun streamed brightly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Diana's expansive, beautifully redesigned corner office. Marcus and Julian were currently sitting in federal holding, awaiting trial without bail, facing decades in prison for corporate fraud, grand larceny, wire fraud, and identity theft. Their illicit assets had been heavily frozen, seized by the SEC, and were being used to pay restitution. Richard, utterly disgraced, broken, and terrified of public ruin and federal prison time, had quietly surrendered his minority shares back to the company at a fraction of their value before retreating into permanent, shameful exile in a non-extradition country. Diana sat comfortably behind her father's massive mahogany desk, running her fingers over the worn wood, reviewing the latest, genuinely profitable quarterly reports. Leo, recently promoted to Chief Financial Officer under Arthur's seasoned, guiding mentorship. Arthur, having chosen to transition to a senior advisory role, knocked politely before entering with a fresh stack of international expansion contracts. Leo treated her with the utmost respect and fierce loyalty, not simply because she carried the founder's last name, but because he had witnessed her walk into a den of wolves and tear a room of traitors apart with terrifying, surgical precision. Later that afternoon, Diana walked down to the main reception area to greet her grandmother for lunch. Chloe, the receptionist, who had learned a very harsh, unforgettable lesson about corporate hierarchy and basic respect, stood up instantly, offering the bright, genuine smile of deep reverence. Diana smiled back, wrapping a warm arm around Eleanor's shoulders as they walked out through the revolving glass doors into the bustling New York streets. She had learned the ultimate, hardest lesson of leadership. True power and lasting legacy were not simply inherited through legal documents or bloodlines. They had to be fiercely protected, continuously earned through fire, and ruthlessly defended against those who tragically mistake quiet patience for weakness.